everyone. Today I'm excited to be talking about some essential pieces of web UI, HTML controls, and some of the really exciting work that is finally being done to help improve styling and extending these native web components. So I have a lot of information to get through, so let's go ahead and dive right in. So my name is Stephanie, and I'm a program manager on Microsoft Edge Developer Experiences. I'm fond of calling that my fancy title because underneath that program manager title, I'm a few different things. I come from a background in design, I have front-end skills, and I am a developer and designer advocate for Microsoft Edge. Now, in my former life as a designer who was also responsible for the development of the site I had designed, I became all too aware of the issues with designing websites and then having to build them and using native form controls and having difficulty with styling them and getting them to render across different browsers the same. Oftentimes it felt like this compared to what was rendering in the different browsers versus my pixel perfect mockups that I would show clients. It felt like this. Everything was just not quite right compared to those mockups that I had shown my client. And my clients would inevitably ask me every single time, why do things look different from your mockups, and why doesn't Internet Explorer look exactly like Chrome? And I didn't understand the web platform at all at the time. I was very much design focused and then learned to code. And so I didn't realize that the root of this issue was actually beyond me. That differences between browsers and browser inconsistencies were normal. I didn't know about browser rendering engines. So I understand this pain point around styling controls and trying to work with the native controls very deeply. And so today I'm hoping to demystify some of these pain points for you all, as well as talk about what's to come to help relieve some of that pain, because there is relief coming. And so today we're going to talk about the past, why HTML controls are the way they are, the present, where we're at now, the current landscape of working with controls, and the future, what's to come with HTML controls, in particular Select, and in some instances the future is now, so some of this work is actually in progress at the moment. So to understand the current problems with controls, we need to go back and review some history, and we need to go all the way back to 1995. So, in my opinion, 1995 was a fabulous year in terms of pop culture. It brought us a lot of very memorable and fun things, in my opinion. It brought us Xena, Warrior Princess, the Macarena, Frappuccinos, the Windows 95 operating system, and then perhaps the most important thing in the history of the web, in my opinion, the HTML 2.0 specification. So this specification is interesting because this is the first standard for HTML that was actually ratified by the W3C. There was no official HTML 1.0 specification. There was a draft that had been circulating around in the early 90s, but what that covered was actually extremely basic in terms of features. And Tim Berners-Lee actually couldn't even get anyone to review it. And so this draft ended up expiring in early 1994. And it was eventually replaced with the HTML 2.0 draft. And that incorporated what was in that HTML 1.0 draft. But its main job was to go out and document and standardize what was already out there in web browsers without breaking functionality. And you might be thinking, well, that doesn't sound too bad. There can't have been that many browsers out there in 1994. This is early days of the web. But there were actually quite a few. There was a library of code that had been provided, and it provided the building blocks for a web browser. And so developers took that and started making their own web browsers. And so between 1991 and 1994, all of these different web browsers popped up. Because HTML was so feature sparse, all of them started implementing their own features to fill out feature gaps. And so this rift in HTML continued to grow up until HTML 2.0. And so HTML 2.0 standardizes what's out there in the web. And with it comes the standardization of form functionality. And with form functionality, it standardized a method for users to enter data into an HTML document and for that data to be used to perform an action, such as logging into a website. Now this is key. It standardized the method only, not the form parts or how they were constructed, just what that data, what that form was supposed to do with that data. And so now we have some standardized HTML building blocks to build websites, but we're still missing something. We're still in the early days of the web. We're lacking a standardized styling language. So CSS wasn't supported by the HTML standard until HTML 3.20 in 1997. And it wasn't even until 1999 that browsers really embraced CSS and supported it with the HTML 4.01 specification. And so if we go back to 1995, we have form controls, but we have no styling language to style them. So browsers had to end up relying on the operating system to render and style those form controls, which led to a dependency on the operating system technically and stylistically. And later, even with early versions of CSS, there were parts of the form controls that CSS just couldn't access. But the other side of this was browser vendors were also extremely reluctant to make controls stylable because they were a reflection of the operating system's visual appearance. They were a part of the UI. The idea that developers would want or need to make form controls look different than what was being rendered wasn't really a concept. And so when they finally accepted that developers wanted to be able to change the appearance of controls, were given the appearance property, but this only controlled the system level styling, didn't actually allow for customization of controls in the way that developers wanted, and therefore developers didn't end up using it for its intended purpose. And even across the different browser engines, it wasn't actually implemented as designed, which then led to many interoperability issues between browsers. We got lots of different vendor prefixes and other issues. And at the time, this is early 2000s, the browser that had the dominant market share, Internet Explorer, didn't even support it. So there were a lot of issues with the appearance property, and didn't really solve that idea of customizing our control styles. And so to quickly recap, pre-1995, we get lots of web browsers that pop up. In 1994, that HTML 1.0 draft expires. In 1995, we get HTML 2.0. That's our first standard by the W3C. We get our first basic HTML form controls with that, but we have no standard for styling, which means that form controls then take an operating system dependency. And by 1999, CSS is fully supported by HTML 4.01, and it is embraced by more browsers. So between 1999 and today, a lot happened with the web. We had a few browser wars for dominant market share. Form controls and functionality obviously continued to be enhanced and worked on. Standards and CSS evolve and are constantly evolving, and we even go on to add new form controls. And so where does that leave us today? It's been over 25 years. It's been nearly 26 years. And so you think we would have figured things out by now, right? But I wouldn't be here speaking to you if that was actually the case. And so there was some great documentation on MDN docs around the current state of form controls and their stylability. And so I've sort of taken that and bucketed them, the different form controls, out into 3 categories to sort of assess the ease of styling form controls as it exists today. And so this first bucket, these can be styled with few problems. These are form control or form, field set, label, output, text field, input, and buttons. And so these pretty easy to style. You're probably not going to run into any issues. The second bucket can be styled with complex CSS and hacks. These are checkbox, radio, and legend. Again, probably need to get a little bit hacky, but you should ultimately be able to achieve what you're trying to achieve, if not without a few bumps or, again, hacks to get that desired result. And then finally, this final bucket I just lovingly refer to as the good night and good luck bucket. These are advanced native controls. These either cannot be styled with CSS or have extremely limited stylability because of the way that they are built and the way that they hook into the platform. And so if we look at those original forms that we got in the HTML 2.0 spec that I have bolded here, we didn't really improve the ease of styling anything. We've got 2 in the easy bucket, 2 in the medium bucket, and 2 in the good luck bucket. And we even went on to add new form controls, and they all got dumped into the we can't style them at all bucket. And so the ease of styling controls, native form controls today, is nowhere near what present day devs need. And so one thing I also want to note here too, that sort of ties into styling these, the CSS specification called out that user agents were the ones responsible for styling controls. That browsers didn't even have to apply CSS to form controls. And so that sort of leads us into the next bucket of issues we have with controls and their appearance. We get lots of browser inconsistencies. And so on the one hand, again, I come from a background in design. These are different companies with different design languages. It makes sense that these would be different, but we're building, or we should be building, to support things across multiple browsers. Things that serve the same function and purpose should be consistent, at least their parts. Like I mentioned previously, the method for entering data was standardized, not the actual form parts. And so, on top of poor CSS access to style controls and browser inconsistencies, we additionally can't actually extend the functionality of a native control. So I love this tweet from Scott Gell. You have one problem. You want icons in your select menu options. You decide to make a custom select menu. You now have at least 75 problems. And it's so true, because when you go and you rebuild a control from scratch, instead of using a native control, you don't get all that good stuff that's baked in, like accessibility and security or even performance. So you have to add all that back in. It's a bad developer experience, but it's necessary if you can't extend the controls in the way you need to. A perfect example of this is the native video element, where a developer either gets all of the controls outlined here in red, or none of them by adding or removing the controls attribute. And so when we want our HTML controls to look like this, or even this, like, it's no wonder developers have just reverted to building forms from scratch. And so we decided on the browser side to take a step back and ask some questions to make sure this is an area that we should go invest in. We knew this was a pain point, but were better native form controls something that developers really wanted us to spend time on? And the answer has overwhelmingly been yes. It turns out developers are tired of spending time recreating the same components when the browser could supply those things natively. And so my former colleague, Greg Whitworth, who is now at Salesforce, conducted a survey on form controls to really start to deep dive into this space. So he sent out an initial survey on Twitter that had nearly 1,400 respondents. And they were in varying roles, from full stack devs to designers, all with varying degrees of experience across web development, so from advanced to beginner. And Greg asked respondents if they had ever used a library or a framework, or if they had built controls from scratch, and if they did, which controls did they create? And these were the top 10. Select was the most recreated form control, followed closely by checkbox, date, radio, file, progress, button, dialog, text area, and text. And then Greg wanted to find out the reasons why people were recreating these form controls. And so well over a third initially said it was because they couldn't change the appearance to the extent that they wanted to. Another third just wanted to add functionality, so they wanted to extend their control. And then just under a third said because of browser inconsistencies, which one might assume has to do with appearance and differences across browsers. And so if we lump that in with the first group of devs who said they couldn't change appearance sufficiently, that's well over 2/3 of developers spending time recreating form controls just to change the appearance. That's a lot of dev time. And so Greg followed up with an amended survey. He asked JSConf EU attendees all the same questions, but he added 2 additional ones. He asked, which form control gives you the most frustration and why? And Select clearly stole the show, with nearly half of respondents saying Select. The next highest control that gave the most frustration was date, and that was only with about a fifth, just under a fifth of respondents. And then he asked why, and these were some of the responses that he got. Select requires hacky tricks, can't style option elements at all to the extent we need to, but the amount of work it takes to implement an accessible alternative with complete feature parity is massive. And I can just feel the pain just oozing out of this response. And so this prompted me to ask my own question. I wanted to know how painful it actually is. And so I did my own research on Twitter. And I asked developers and front-end designers to please fill in the blank. I would rather blank than attempt to style a native Select element. Oh, and it turns out y'all do not like Select. You really, it causes you so much pain. So much pain. And so I think I got about 250 responses to this tweet. I think it's one of my tweets that's gotten the most responses ever. And there were lots of good responses. These are some of my favorites. I'll just highlight a couple here. So I would rather call each person attempting to use the form and ask them what option they would like than attempt to style a native Select menu. I would rather convince my fellow programmers to reinstall Silverlight I'd rather breakdance barefoot on a pile of Legos. I'd rather grind my teeth to the jawbone with rough sandpaper. And continuously my favorite, I would rather heat up a rusty old fork with a few tines snapped off and broken, and then with both arms thrust it into my inner thigh than attempt to style a native Select menu. Clearly, Select is a pain point for developers. A huge pain point. So let's talk about what we're going to do to relieve some of that pain, and talk about the future and what's to come. So I'm excited to say that the future is shiny. There's some fantastic work and lots of work being done at the moment. I'm going to talk about some new components. I'm going to talk about standardizing controls, and just what we've done to existing controls that the browser natively supplies. And so, as always, HTML, like I said, there's some new components in the works. It's a living language. It's not done. Again, there's some exciting work being done there. But first, let's talk about what we've been doing to our existing form controls. So on the Edge team, we have been collaborating closely with Chrome. Last year, we made updates to the controls in the Chromium project, and our initial focus was new styles, and additionally accessibility improvements. So when we moved from the Edge HTML browser rendering engine into Chromium, we wanted to be sure to bring over some of that fantastic accessibility work that was in Edge HTML. And so we brought that into Chromium. And then we worked on a much needed visual refresh of the native form controls. So losing those gradients and shadows, bringing a much more neutral and universal style that we're hoping developers will leverage while we get the standards work started for more in-depth customizations. So we're hoping that this, at least for the moment, lessens the time spent recreating form controls with this more neutral look. We're hoping, again, this is neutral enough that these can serve as a placeholder while we get that standards work started that will enable developers to customize much more in depth. And secondly, like I said, HTML isn't done. So we're looking at new native elements. In a previous version of this talk, I had mentioned the Chrome team had taken on looking at toggle switch and virtual list. And going to check on the status of these, it appears they've both been abandoned at the moment. But, and I cannot speak for Chrome, but I want to say this doesn't necessarily mean we won't get them someday. If these are things that you'd like to see native elements for, please be vocal about that on Twitter, on the different browser engine status pages, GitHub. Let us know. The more developer signal we have, the more that sort of allows us to say that this is an area that we should go look at. So please, if these are things that you're interested in, make some noise about it. We're listening. But it's not all bad news. So I am really excited to introduce a new Popup element proposal that was made public at the end of January. And this proposal really evolved as the team started to take an in-depth look at Select, and they identified a need for this universal pop-up element. And so I'm going to dive into some of the highlights of this proposal explainer for this element. And so the team identified many cases in which a developer needs to create this transient user interface that gets displayed on top of all other web UI. Some examples of these things are things like action menus and form element suggestions, content pickers, and even things like teaching UI. And so the goals with this that this explainer sort of set out to accomplish in regards to the pop-up element. We want this element to be able to contain arbitrary content. We want it to be fully stylable, so including properties which require compositing with other layers of the host web application, so like the box shadow or backdrop filter CSS properties. We want it to be sized and positioned to the author's discretion. These elements are rendered on top of all other content in the host web application. These include an appropriate user input management experience out of the box, with flexibility to modify behaviors such as initial focus. And most importantly, in my opinion, these are accessible by default, with the ability to further extend semantics and behaviors as needed for the author's specific use case. And so with the pop-up element, we've sort of agreed, at least for the proposal portion of this, that this pop-up element has this behavior that we're calling light dismiss. And so this is what distinguishes these pop-ups from other elements that are aesthetically similar. And so those elements that are aesthetically similar don't have this light dismiss behavior. And we suggest using the dialogue element or other new purpose-built elements instead of this pop-up element. And so an open pop-up that has this light dismiss behavior means that it will automatically be hidden when one of three things happens. So the user either hits the escape key, the layout of the pop-up or its anchor element is changed, or focus moves outside of the pop-up and its anchor element, if applicable. And so a generalized definition of light dismiss is currently being discussed in the OpenUI standards group, which I will touch on shortly. And so some examples of elements that don't have light dismiss behavior are alerts, toasts, custom tooltips, miscellaneous persistent popover UI. And so let's take a look at a basic example for the pop-up element. So here we have a button element and a pop-up element. And to tie the button to the pop-up, we have our button ID equals menu button. And we'd use an anchor attribute and set that value to the button ID of menu button. So anchor equals menu button. And one thing I want to note here too is currently our pop-up menus are not visible until show is called by the author. So we do have that bit of script down below. And so this new pop-up element proposal suggests that pop-ups should have show and hide methods. There is intent to further explore a script list invocation, optional attributes for focus management, so autofocus and delegate focus, optional anchor attribute, so used to tie pop-up to an activating element like we just looked at in that basic example. And again, that has that light dismiss behavior. So there's a lot more information in the pop-up explainer, the proposal documents. If you go to aka.ms/popup-explainer, go check that out. And if you have any feedback, please be sure to leave some feedback in the GitHub, open a GitHub issue, or even engage with the proposal authors on Twitter. They've been very receptive to receiving feedback on this proposal via those methods. So now I want to talk about perhaps the part of this that I'm most excited about. Let's talk about fixing the current problems with styling controls. And so last August 2020, an explainer with proposed solutions for how we're going to approach enabling customization of controls UI was recently released by the Chrome, Edge, and OpenUI teams. And so the proposal for form controls is using a pattern called the MVC design pattern, where the form control is made up of three different parts, a model, a view, and a controller. Now, there is a lot of information out there on the web on this pattern. It's quite a common pattern in software engineering. so I'm not going to dive too in-depth into it, but if you go search for it, you'll get lots of information on it. And so these are the goals that the proposed solution explainer set out to accomplish. So we want devs to be able to style any arbitrary part of a native control. We want them to be able to add arbitrary content into a control, style a particular part without rewriting the whole UI, customize UI without re-implementing the data model and code for reacting to user input, and again, most importantly, in my opinion, customized controls are accessible by default. So we're proposing 3 different solutions that offer a range of flexibility and customization depending on what the developer wants. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in to our first solution. So we talked about the history of controls, and the root of the issue is that form controls and their parts are not standardized and they're not reachable by developers. Browser engines choose to render those form controls and build them in a way that is different from one another, and so that's why we're unable to give developers access to the parts they need to style something, because it's not done in an interoperable manner. And so our first solution focuses on standardizing control UI anatomy, parts, and behavior. And so OpenUI is the initiative under the YCG, the Web Incubator Community Group, to standardize form controls and components. And the OpenUI team, which is open to anyone who would like to participate, please come join us. It's a fabulous group. Is focused on researching and documenting design systems and frameworks out there today. And they're going on to identify patterns in naming and use cases, and using those patterns to establish cal paths for standards and eventually browsers. And because Select is the biggest pain point for developers, it was the first form control that OpenUI started to research. So if you go to the OpenUI website, open-ui.org, there is an editor's draft proposal for Select. If you want to go explore that further, there's lots of details in there. And so when I talk about standardizing control anatomy, I'll use Select as an example of what that looks like. And so we could define the anatomy of a select as consisting of one button part, containing one selected value part, and one pop-up list box part, containing 0 to n option parts. And then we'd go on to define the expected behavior of a select, like what happens when you click on it, and so on. And so this standardized anatomy will allow the styling of native parts using pseudo classes and the part pseudo element. So a developer will be able to change the color of a selects button in an interoperable manner without replacing any of the HTML. So in our example here, we have our CSS class called styled select, and we're utilizing the part pseudo element to target the button to change the background color. Notice here that the HTML code is just the code of a select today. So you wouldn't have to rewrite any of the actual form control. We're just exposing the parts of a select and giving devs access to styling via those pseudo elements and classes. And additionally, other states will also be standardized. For example, like the open state here for select. So we'd have styled-select open part button. So that's just another example of an additional state there. So our second proposal is something called named slots. And this proposal enables more powerful customization of controls and content. And so a set of slot names will correspond to each piece of the controls view, so that a developer might want to replace with their own content. So in the case of select, we would have a slot equals button and slot equals list box. And that will indicate to the platform that custom content will be slotted in by the developer. And in addition, developers would also add a part equals button and part equals list box, which I'll go into briefly in a moment about why that is needed. And so if you've ever wanted to add a country flag or some other visual content into your list box for Select, this will allow you to do it without rewriting the whole control from scratch. Additionally, we would love for slots to be able to provide the flexibility to customize only a part of a control. So we'll look at input type equals range as an example of that. So a developer could provide a slot and a part for just the movable thumb, and the UI for the track would automatically fall back to the default provided by the platform. And I want to note here too that with this solution and this code, there's a lot of other work that would need to be done to input to make this possible. So please check out the explainer for a lot more detail on this. I'll have a link to that explainer here towards the end of it, but this is sort of the ideal state of how we would like that to look. And so I mentioned adding a part equals button, part equals list box, and you might be wondering, why do I have to provide that and a slot name? So platform code will be wired up to identify elements corresponding to those required control parts, and it will apply native event handlers where applicable to handle user input. So this will let developers make UI tweaks without having to write tons of JavaScript to handle input, and ensures those customized user interfaces can handle all the input modalities users expect. So by adding that part equals button or part equals whatever, that's indicating to the platform that it has some work to do for you. And our final and third solution is shadow DOM replacement. So currently, you cannot call attach shadow on a form control. It throws an exception. We're proposing that this restriction be removed when enabling customization for a given control type. And calling attach shadow will result in the default user agent shadow DOM being swapped out with a new shadow root that'll be populated with content provided by the developer. Even in this instance, also, developers will still be required to label the core parts of their shadow DOM using the part attribute. Otherwise, the shadow DOM will not be rendered at all. Requiring that these parts be supplied also ensures that the correct accessibility semantics and those user input event handlers that I mentioned before get applied by the platform. So when I talked about customized controls being accessible by default, this is how we're going to do it with these parts. And so the platform is not going to make an attempt to guess at the correct behavior and will not render an incomplete control implementation. And again, you can just let the platform do what it was supposed to for you, which is a small price to pay by just adding part equals whatever your part is. And so I want to give a shout out to the team that worked on this explainer. Folks from Microsoft, Google, and Salesforce all worked on this. If you're interested in the full explainer document, you can go to aka.ms/controls-explainer. There are lots of technical details in that explainer that I don't have time to go into today, and many more examples. So if this is something that interests you, I definitely recommend going to check that out. And we need you. We need your feedback and opinions on this work. And there are multiple ways to do that. And so you can come join us in the OpenUI YCG group. Come contribute to the form control investigations there. It's a great group, super welcoming. And we could use all the help we can get. This is a group through the Web Incubator community group. Secondly, tell browser vendors what you need from your form controls. Let us know on Twitter or GitHub. Please leave comments on these explainers. people are listening, and we want your feedback. And again, that ties into the third point. Please provide feedback on the explainers. We are listening. We want to ensure that we are building components that behave in the way that developers expect them to. And so we can't do that without your input. So go ahead, and if you're on Twitter, follow these folks. So Melanie Said is Melanie Richard. She is the Microsoft Edge PM. Greg Whitworth is at Salesforce and is leading OpenUI. Stubbornella is Nicole Sullivan. She's the Google Chrome PM. And I'm Ciata Stephanie. I'm the Microsoft Edge PM, who kind of supports Greg a little bit with OpenUI, and I support Melanie as well. And so we are here to listen to all your feedback, because ultimately these improvements are for you. Thank you.